With the munitions crisis of February 1915, it became imperative for each of the belligerent powers to put their economy on a war footing. This led to the creation of what people at the time called total war. Now, in fact, total war will be invested and brought off the shelf in World War II. But we see its very beginnings in World War I when governments intervene to shape the economic structure of their country, the social structure, and the financial structure. One thing you can see very easily if you look in the posters section of the My Great War blog at the Pinterest, under posters, you'll see all sorts of posters and encouragements for war loans, to buy war bonds. Each of the belligerent parties attempted in a very 19th century fashion to raise money as you go by asking people for voluntary contributions. All of the belligerents as well introduced it was different from country to country, various types of new taxes. The United States introduces the income tax. Okay, so we have all sorts of things going on like that. I want to look in particular at two attempts to create a total war economy in Germany, both of which ended up just really not working at all. The first was the so-called pig murder, or Schweinmord. I do relish the term Schweinmord. The pig massacre. In January and February of 1915, officials in the Prussian Ministry of Agriculture became afraid that there was insufficient grain to make bread to feed the German population. Now, this was an inaccurate observation, the sort of muddle-headed shit that only a bureaucrat sitting in a capital could ever think up. But they decided that Germany would starve if they kept feeding grain to livestock. And in Germany, the livestock of choice is the pig, the Schwein. And so these ministers decided that to save money, to save grain, they're going to have to kill the pigs. So they ordered the pig massacre. Now, okay. Based on inappropriate knowledge of the grain supply. Well, okay, so the pig herd is slaughtered. There's a lot more sausage, there's a lot more Wiener Schnitzel on people's plates in the summer of 1915, and then you run into a small problem. You've killed all the breeding sow, and so how are you going to get the next generation of little piggies? Okay, the bureaucrats hadn't thought of that one. Most of them were university professors, which makes it even more normative. We can't find our way out of a paper bag as a rule. The result is a meat shortage throughout the remainder of the war for the Germans. Now, this is significant. In the decade before the First World War, because of rising real wages, because of rising well-being, German industrial workers had become used to eating meat every day. This had not been the case before 1900. But after 1900, and I've done studies on this, the amount of per capita meat consumption has exploded, maybe 4 times. What happened was that people began to feel that they weren't full unless they had meat in their belly. You know, you could have all the potato soup and bread you want, but you just really just need a little piece of sausage in there to feel full. And so, although on a per calorie basis, Germans weren't hungry in 1916, they felt like they were. The real hunger came in 1917 when everything began to really fall apart. And people remember the winter of 1916-1917 as the turnip winter, because that was all people in cities had to eat. So, big bright idea, didn't work so well. The second bright idea that I'd like to talk about is the auxiliary service law. The German government knew that to continue to produce the weapons and the supplies that it needed to maintain the war. It needed to have skilled workers in place doing them. Now, one of the problems in mobilization was all sorts of men were called to arms. They went off to fight, and lathes and pit heads remained empty. So in the course of 1915, when it was clear that victory wasn't there at that very moment, the government had to the military had to comb through the ranks and take skilled workers and return them to the mines and the shops so that they could be involved in fulfilling war contracts. Well, as 15 moved into 16, one of the problems was that employers, factory owners and employers, had secured war contracts, and they needed to provide X amount of widgets to the government to fulfill their contracts so that they could get paid. Well, if you didn't have enough widget makers, you were in trouble. So what happened was that factory owners, particularly in the munitions industry, began to bid up the wages of skilled workers. So if you were a skilled machinist, and you could move to the factory down the block and make more money. And if you weren't happy there, you moved to the factory next. So you had this continual spiraling up of wages and benefits as factory owners are desperate to get skilled workers to fill slots so they can fill their contracts. Pushed by the military, the government issued something called the Auxiliary Service Law, which in effect was an attempt to draft all industrial workers, so more or less, into the army and to restrict their movement. They became sort of industrial serfs. So if the auxiliary service law really worked, you wouldn't be able to move from one factory to the next to the next. You were stuck in place. Of course, factory owners found ways around the auxiliary service law. There were all sorts of loopholes, and they would find ways. They would still try to bid up wages and benefits to get people so they could fulfill their contract. A second side of the auxiliary service law that employers weren't particularly fond of was the recognition of workers' representatives, the recognition of unions, so that with the functioning of the auxiliary service law, both employers and union and government would sit down together and work on working conditions and so on and so forth. The individuals in the Prussian War Ministry referred to this as war socialism. It set a precedent so that with the recognition of unions in particular, such that when the war was over, employers were not able to go back to the old banning of unions, the old, what the Germans called Herr im Haus, the lord of the castle sort of mentality, this recognition of unions that continues in Germany to this day. So government attempts to regulate production to create war economy in Germany misfired almost every time they tried. The British and the French were more successful. The Russians were, of course, spectacularly unsuccessful. They got rebellion out of the whole deal. So, thank you.